We live in a culture obsessed with self-improvement, where everyone is optimizing their morning routines, curating their best selves on social media, and desperately trying to become the version of themselves they think they should be. Society rewards the polished, the positive, the put together. We're told that success means eliminating our flaws, transcending our darker impulses, and becoming pure vessels of productivity and light. The consequence? We've become strangers to half of who we are. But what if the parts of yourself you're trying to eliminate are actually the most powerful forces in your psyche? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who broke from Freud to explore the depths of the unconscious mind, believes something radical, that your shadow, the collection of traits, desires, and impulses you've rejected and hidden, speaks louder than your carefully constructed ego. Jung argued that the denied, repressed, and condemned aspects of your personality don't disappear. They accumulate power in the darkness, influencing your decisions, relationships, and life trajectory in ways you cannot see. Jung didn't arrive at this conclusion through theory alone. He spent years confronting his own shadow, documenting visions and voices that emerged from his unconscious in what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. What he discovered transformed not only his life, but the entire field of depth psychology. He found that the people who achieved genuine psychological integration weren't those who successfully eliminated their darkness, but those who turned toward it, acknowledged it, and integrated it into conscious awareness. In this video, we'll explore why your shadow holds more influence over your life than your conscious intentions, how Jung discovered this truth through his own psychological crisis, and what it actually means to integrate your shadow rather than wage war against it. You'll discover why the traits you most despise in others are keys to understanding yourself, how your shadow sabotages your relationships and goals, and why embracing your darkness is the only path to becoming whole. Jung understood something most people never realize. You are in conversation with your shadow every single day, but you mistake its voice for external reality. When you feel inexplicably irritated by a colleague's confidence, when you sabotage relationships just as they deepen, when you find yourself repeating patterns you swore you'd never repeat, your shadow is speaking. The ego believes it's in control, making rational decisions based on conscious values. Meanwhile, the shadow operates like a puppet master, pulling strings you cannot see. The truth Jung discovered through decades of clinical work is that the shadow forms in childhood, not through dramatic trauma alone, but through 1,000 small moments of learning what is acceptable and what must be hidden. A child who is punished for expressing anger learns to exile that anger into the shadow. A child praised only for achievement learns to hide their need for rest and vulnerability. A child told that certain desires are shameful learns to construct an identity that explicitly excludes those desires. The shadow is the archive of everything you had to deny to be loved, to belong, to survive. Consider the man who prides himself on being rational, controlled, and civilized. He judges emotional people as weak, chaotic, unstable. What he doesn't see is that his own rejected emotionality has gone underground, emerging as passive-aggressive comments, sudden irrational outbursts, or chronic anxiety he cannot explain. His shadow speaks through symptoms he attributes to external causes: stress at work, difficult people, bad luck. He spends his life managing the consequences of his shadow without ever recognizing the source. Or consider the woman who has built her identity around being kind, agreeable, and selfless. She cannot tolerate conflict, avoids confrontation, and feels genuine distress when others perceive her as difficult or demanding. What she doesn't realize is that her shadow has accumulated years of unexpressed rage, boundaries violated, needs ignored. That rage speaks anyway, through chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, depression she cannot name, or sudden explosions that shock even herself. She apologizes for these moments, calls them aberrations, and redoubles her efforts to be kind. The cycle continues. Jung observed in his clinical practice that the most dangerous shadows belonged not to people who acknowledged their darkness, but to those who believed they had none. The person convinced of their own goodness is capable of tremendous cruelty without recognizing it as such. The person certain they have no prejudice often harbors the deepest biases. The person who claims to have transcended ego often has the most fragile and defended sense of self. The shadow grows in proportion to the light we shine on our conscious identity. In his own life, Jung experienced this firsthand during his break from Freud between 1913 and 1916. As his professional identity crumbled and his unconscious began to erupt, Jung found himself confronting visions, voices, and aspects of his psyche he had never acknowledged. He wasn't having a mere intellectual crisis. He was facing psychological disintegration. He He later wrote that he felt as though he were living in a constant state of inner tension, never knowing what the unconscious would present next. His ego, his professional reputation, his rational mind, none of these could control what emerged from the depths. What Jung discovered during this period was that the shadow doesn't speak in logical arguments or conscious thoughts. It speaks through dreams that disturb you, through the people who trigger disproportionate reactions, through the patterns you repeat despite knowing better, through the parts of your life where you feel most out of control. The shadow speaks loudest precisely in the moments when you're most certain you're in control, because those are the moments when you're most defended against seeing it. The people Jung worked with who achieved genuine transformation weren't those who became better at managing their shadows. They were the ones who stopped trying to eliminate their darkness and started asking what it had to say. They discovered that the shadow contains not only rejected weaknesses, but also rejected strengths. Power they were afraid to claim, creativity they were taught to suppress, authenticity they learned was too dangerous to express. The shadow holds everything that doesn't fit the narrow definition of who you think you should be. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't want to meet their shadow. They want techniques to overcome it, strategies to transcend it, methods to make it disappear. They approach shadow work like another self-improvement project, another problem to solve, another step toward becoming their ideal self. This approach guarantees failure because it's still the ego trying to maintain control, still the conscious mind trying to dominate the unconscious, still the same pattern that created the shadow in the first place. Jung knew that real shadow work requires something different. It requires a willingness to be wrong about who you are. It requires the courage to discover that traits you've condemned in others live inside you. It requires the humility to admit that your conscious intentions don't determine your impact on the world. It requires the radical act of listening to the parts of yourself you've spent your whole life silencing. This isn't improvement, it's transformation. And transformation, Jung understood, always begins with dissent. If this content is making sense to you, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The question isn't whether you have a shadow, everyone does. The question is whether you're willing to turn toward it before it speaks louder than you can ignore. Jung's answer emerged from his willingness to descend into his own darkness. He didn't transcend his shadow through willpower or positive thinking. He met it on its own terms, in its own territory, through a practice he would later formalize as active imagination. What he found there would change everything he understood about the human psyche and the path to wholeness. The term Jung used for the shadow is deceptively simple, but what it describes is profoundly complex. The shadow is not merely your dark side or your bad qualities. It's the sum total of everything about yourself that you've been forced to deny, repress, or reject to construct your conscious identity. Jung wrote that the shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors. It's both personal and primordial, both learned and inherited. Jung didn't develop this concept from theory. He discovered it through the most terrifying period of his life. In 1913, at the height of his professional success, Jung's relationship with Freud collapsed. Beyond losing a mentor, Jung lost the theoretical framework that had organized his understanding of the psyche. What followed was what Jung called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period where the boundary between sanity and madness felt dangerously thin. He was 40 years old, with a family, a career, and a reputation, and he chose to descend. Jung began a deliberate practice of engaging with the figures, images, and voices that emerged from his unconscious. He didn't try to analyze them away or reduce them to symptoms. He entered into dialogue with them. He met Elijah and Salome, Philemon and Kai, figures that seemed to have their own autonomy, their own wisdom, their own agenda. These weren't random fantasies. They were personifications of rejected aspects of his psyche, demanding recognition. His shadow wasn't a single dark figure, but a cast of characters, each representing something he had denied. This period lasted years. It wasn't a weekend workshop or a month-long intensive. It was sustained, disciplined confrontation with the parts of himself he had spent decades constructing his identity against. Jung recorded these encounters in what would later become the Red Book, a manuscript he kept private for decades because he knew how easily such material could be misunderstood. He wasn't having a mystical experience. He was doing the dangerous, unglamorous work of psychological integration. The process was anything but romantic. Jung experienced genuine fear that he was going mad, that he would lose his grip on consensus reality entirely. He maintained his clinical practice, his family life, his professional responsibilities, all while internally navigating a psychological landscape that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself. This is the nature of shadow work that self-help culture doesn't advertise. It destabilizes your sense of self before it reconstructs it. It breaks you down before it builds you up. What emerged from Jung's confrontation was a revolutionary understanding. The shadow speaks through projection. The traits you most despise in others, the people who trigger disproportionate emotional reactions, the qualities you find most threatening or contemptible, these are mirrors reflecting your own rejected aspects. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The patient who railed against dishonesty was often hiding from their own deceptions. The person who judged others' selfishness was denying their own unmet needs. The shadow doesn't remain internal. It colonizes your perception of external reality. Jung came to see that the shadow contains not only inferior qualities but also positive potentials you've been too afraid to claim. The person who judges others' arrogance may be suppressing their own legitimate power. The person who condemns others' sensuality may be denying their own vitality. The shadow holds everything that doesn't conform to your conscious identity, which means it holds the raw material of your wholeness. To integrate the shadow isn't to become worse, it's to become complete. For Jung, shadow work required what he called ethical confrontation with the shadow. This meant more than intellectual acknowledgement. It meant taking moral responsibility for the discovery that you are not who you think you are, that you're capable of what you've condemned in others, that your good intentions don't erase your unconscious impact. It meant letting your self-image shatter so something more honest could emerge. The goal wasn't to eliminate the shadow or to overcome it. The goal was integration, bringing the shadow into conscious awareness so it no longer operates autonomously, influencing your life from behind the scenes. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the work. Not transcending your shadow, but recognizing it, owning it, and consciously deciding how to relate to the energy it contains. For this work to be effective, Jung insisted, it requires something most people are unwilling to give: radical honesty. Not honesty in the sense of telling others what you think of them, but honesty about what you think you're hiding from yourself. It requires a willingness to be wrong, to be smaller than you thought, to be more flawed than you admit, and paradoxically, to be more powerful than you've allowed yourself to be. This brings us to the essential question: how does one actually engage with the shadow? Jung provided a structure, not a formula, because he knew that each person's shadow is unique, but certain principles apply universally. Certain practices create the conditions for shadow integration. And these practices look nothing like the self-improvement industry's version of shadow work. They're harder, slower, and infinitely more transformative. Shadow work is not about excavating childhood trauma to explain away current behavior. It's not about forgiving yourself for being human or learning to love your flaws. These might be byproducts, but they're not the work itself. Real shadow work, as Jung practiced and taught it, is about ending the internal war between who you think you are and who you actually are. It's about recovering the energy you've spent, maintaining the persona, the social mask you show the world, and redirecting that energy toward becoming whole. Jung identified several pillars of effective shadow work, though he never reduced it to a step-by-step process. The first pillar is observation without judgment. This means developing the capacity to notice your reactions, particularly the intense ones, without immediately justifying them or explaining them away. When someone triggers you, when you have a disproportionate emotional response, when you find yourself repeatedly criticizing a particular trait in others, these are all signals. The shadow is speaking. Most people immediately defend their reactions, constructing narratives about why their response was appropriate, justified, rational. Jung asks you to pause and ask instead, what is this telling me about what I've rejected in myself? The second pillar is active imagination, the practice Jung developed during his confrontation with the unconscious. This is not passive daydreaming or visualization exercises. It's a disciplined engagement with unconscious figures and images that emerge spontaneously. You enter a relaxed state and allow images to arise, then engage them in dialogue. You ask them questions, listen to their responses, let the conversation unfold. Jung emphasized that this requires treating these figures as genuinely autonomous, not as aspects you're consciously controlling. The shadow reveals itself through these encounters, speaking in symbols, stories, and images the conscious mind would never construct. The third pillar is dream work. Jung saw dreams as the most direct communication from the unconscious to consciousness. Your dreams, particularly recurring ones or those with strong emotional content, are your shadow attempting to get your attention. But dreams don't speak in literal terms. They speak in the language of symbols, metaphors, and archetypal images. Learning to work with dreams means learning to listen to how your shadow speaks when your ego is asleep and can't interfere. Jung kept a dream journal for decades, treating his dreams as essential messages from the parts of himself his conscious mind couldn't see. The fourth pillar is confronting your projections. This is perhaps the most difficult because it requires admitting that your experience of other people is often more about you than them. When you find yourself having strong judgments about someone's behavior, particularly moral judgments, Jung would ask, where do you do a version of this in your own life? The colleague you judge as manipulative? Where are you controlling? The person you condemn as selfish? Where are your needs unmet? The shadow always reveals itself through what you cannot tolerate in others. Withdrawing projections means taking back the energy you've placed outside yourself and recognizing it as yours. Jung demonstrated these principles in his own life. After his confrontation with the unconscious, he emerged as a different man. He didn't become perfect or enlightened. He became more honest, more integrated, more capable of holding paradox. He stopped pretending he was only his conscious values and started acknowledging the full spectrum of his psyche. His work deepened, his relationships transformed, his creative output exploded, but none of this came from adding something new. It came from stopping the exhausting work of keeping half of himself hidden. The process required that Jung develop an entirely new relationship with discomfort. Most people, when they encounter uncomfortable emotions or disturbing thoughts, immediately try to change them, fix them, or distract themselves. Jung learned to sit with discomfort, to let the shadow speak without immediately shutting it down. He found that the shadow doesn't reveal itself to people who are trying to get rid of it. It reveals itself to people who are willing to listen, even when what it has to say contradicts everything the ego holds dear. Jung also emphasized the necessity of creating a container for this work, a physical space, a journal, a practice that held the process. Shadow work isn't something you do casually between other tasks. It requires dedicated time, protected space, and sustained attention. Jung spent hours in his tower in Bollingen, away from the demands of his professional life, engaging with his unconscious. This wasn't luxury, it was necessity. The shadow doesn't reveal itself amid distraction. This leads us to a crucial transition in Jung's understanding. Shadow work inevitably brings you to a confrontation that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. When you stop defending your identity and start examining it honestly, when you withdraw your projections and own your disowned parts, you come face to face with something terrifying. You discover that your carefully constructed self is largely fiction, that the story you tell about who you are is a defense mechanism, that the real you has been waiting in the darkness all along. But now, having walked through the psychological terrain, you might be wondering what actually happens when someone engages in authentic shadow work. What is the subjective experience of turning toward the parts of yourself you've spent decades fleeing? What does it feel like when the shadow begins to speak and you, for the first time, actually listen? This is where Jung's insights move from theory into lived experience, from concept into confrontation. The confrontation with the shadow doesn't announce itself with trumpets or clear milestone. It begins in silence, in moments of unexpected stillness when your usual distractions fall away. You might be sitting alone at night, or walking without your phone, or in the space between waking and sleeping, and suddenly there's a thought or feeling you've been successfully avoiding for years. It surfaces without permission, like something that's been underwater finally breaking through. The real test isn't whether you can identify your shadow intellectually. Anyone can make a list of their flaws or acknowledged rejected traits. The real test is whether you can stay present when your shadow reveals itself in real time, in the middle of your life. It's that moment when you catch yourself doing exactly what you swore you'd never do, when you hear your parents' voice coming out of your mouth, when you recognize that the pattern you've criticized in everyone else is playing out in your own behavior. Most people in this moment immediately rationalize, justify, or dissociate. They create distance between themselves and what they're seeing. Jung understood that the psychological pain that emerges during shadow work is not the pain of discovering something new. It's the pain of finally acknowledging what you've always known but never admitted. It's the pain of dropping the story you've been telling about yourself. Your shadow doesn't surprise you with information from outside. It confirms what you've been working desperately to deny. The man who prides himself on rationality finally admits he's been running from his emotions his entire life. The woman who built her identity on independence finally sees how terrified she is of genuine connection. The activist who condemns others' privilege finally recognizes their own. This is when your mind will offer you 1,000 exits. It will suggest this is too painful, too overwhelming, too much to face right now. It will remind you of your responsibilities, your deadlines, your need to stay functional. It will offer philosophical arguments about why self-examination is narcissistic or why the past doesn't matter. It will generate anger at Jung at this video at the very suggestion that you need to look at your shadow. These are not rational assessments. They're the ego's defense mechanisms activating to protect the identity structure you've built. But if you resist the urge to flee back into your familiar patterns, something else begins to happen. The feelings you've been avoiding, once you actually allow yourself to feel them fully, begin to move. The rage you've suppressed for decades, when you finally let yourself feel it without acting it out, transforms into clarity about your boundaries. The grief you've been running from, when you finally let it surface, becomes the ground for genuine compassion. The fear you've been denying, when you finally acknowledge it, reveals what actually matters to you. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. This isn't poetic exaggeration, it's clinical observation. The shadow carries the accumulated psychic weight of everything you've had to reject to construct your identity. Integrating it means feeling the full weight of that rejection. It means recognizing all the ways you've betrayed yourself to be loved, all the parts of yourself you've condemned to maintain your self-image, all the energy you've expended keeping half of who you are in exile. The discomfort serves a specific function. It's the psychic equivalent of inflammation around a wound. It signals that integration is happening, that the boundaries between conscious and unconscious are shifting. Jung observed that his patients who reported the most discomfort during this process were often the ones making the most progress. The ones who found it easy or pleasant were usually still working at the surface level, rearranging their self-concept without fundamentally transforming it. What emerges in these moments of genuine confrontation are insights you cannot think your way to. You suddenly understand why you sabotage that relationship, why you keep choosing the same type of partner, why you feel empty after achieving what you thought you wanted. These aren't intellectual realizations, they're full-body recognitions. You feel the truth of them in your body before your mind can construct an explanation. The shadow speaks in sensations, emotions, and visceral knowing before it speaks in words. Jung emphasized that this discomfort is not pathological. It's transformational. The culture teaches you to medicate it away, distract yourself from it, think positive thoughts to overcome it. Jung teaches something radically different, that the discomfort is the process. You don't get through it by avoiding it or bypassing it. You get through it by going through it, by staying present to the psychological pain of seeing yourself clearly for the first time, by allowing your false self to die so your real self can emerge. The metaphor Jung used was alchemical. Shadow work is the nigredo, the blackening, the necessary stage of decomposition before transformation can occur. The alchemists understood that you can't transmute lead into gold without first reducing it to its prima materia, its fundamental substance. Psychologically, this means you can't become whole without first dissolving the false unity of the ego, without decomposing the identity structures that have held you together. The darkness isn't something to get through as quickly as possible, it's the crucible in which transformation occurs. This understanding shifts everything. The goal is no longer to avoid discomfort or pain, but to develop the capacity to remain present to it without being destroyed by it. Jung called this developing a strong ego, not in the sense of being arrogant or inflated, but in the sense of having a psychological center stable enough to withstand the encounter with the shadow without fragmenting. Most people's egos are actually quite fragile, which is why they require constant defense and maintenance. A truly strong ego can look at the shadow without collapsing. The most surprising part of this confrontation for many people is discovering that their shadow isn't only dark. What they find in the depths isn't only their rejected weaknesses, but also their disowned power, creativity, vitality, and authenticity. They discover that they've been hiding their light as much as their darkness, that they've made themselves small to avoid threatening others, that they've suppressed their gifts because they learned that being fully themselves was somehow dangerous. The shadow holds everything that doesn't fit your conscious identity, and that includes potentials you've been too afraid to claim. But you only discover this by going through the darkness first. There is no bypass, no shortcut that lets you skip the confrontation and go straight to integration. Jung was clear about this. The path to wholeness leads through the valley of shadow. And what awaits on the other side is not the person you thought you were trying to become, but the person you've been all along, finally freed from the prison of your own denial. The transformation that emerges from authentic shadow work doesn't happen suddenly. There's no moment when you wake up and everything has changed. Instead, the shift occurs gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. You notice that situations that used to trigger intense emotional reactions no longer carry the same charge. The colleague whose confidence irritated you now just seems confident. Your projection has been withdrawn. The pattern you use to repeat unconsciously now becomes visible before you enact it, giving you the choice to do something different. Jung observed that the people who had genuinely integrated their shadows carried themselves differently. Not with the artificial confidence of someone who's convinced themselves they're perfect, but with the quiet groundedness of someone who knows exactly who they are, including the parts they're not proud of. They stop defending themselves so vigorously because they've already acknowledged their flaws privately. They become less judgmental of others because they've faced their own capacity for the same behaviors. The irony Jung discovered is that when you stop trying to be good and start trying to be whole, you often become more genuinely ethical. The person who acknowledges their capacity for cruelty is less likely to be casually cruel than the person who believes they're incapable of it. The person who owns their shadow is less likely to project it onto others. The person who has faced their own darkness develops genuine compassion for others' struggles rather than the conditional kindness of someone who still believes they're morally superior. But here's what's truly paradoxical. When you return from the shadow work, when you re-enter your life having done the inner work of integration, most people won't recognize what's different about you. They might notice you're calmer, more present, less reactive, but they won't understand the magnitude of the internal shift because you don't look fundamentally transformed from the outside. You look like yourself, just somehow more so. Your family might find it unsettling that you no longer react to the old provocations, that you've stopped playing your assigned role in the family system. Your friends might feel confused that you no longer participate in certain conversations or tolerate certain dynamics. Your colleagues might be thrown off by your new clarity about boundaries or your refusal to engage in office politics. People are accustomed to your shadow. They've learned to navigate around it, to trigger it when useful, to rely on your predictable reactions. Jung noted that genuine transformation often disturbs the people around you more than dramatic external changes would. If you got a new job or moved to a new city, people would understand. But when you shift internally, when you withdraw your projections and stop acting out your shadow unconsciously, you disrupt the entire relational field. People might accuse you of being different in ways they can't quite articulate. They're not wrong, you are different. But the difference isn't that you've become someone new. It's that you've stopped being someone false. The anticlimax of shadow work is that you don't emerge as a superhero or an enlightened being. You emerge as yourself, but with access to your full psychic energy, instead of half of it drained by the constant work of repression. You're not suddenly without flaws or struggles. You're just no longer at war with them. You're not suddenly perfect. You're just finally honest. And that honesty, Jung discovered, is more powerful than any persona you could construct. This is the return Jung described in his model of individuation, not a return to who you were before, but a return to your life with your shadow integrated rather than projected. You go back to the same relationships, the same work, the same world, but you inhabit them differently. You're no longer performing a role based on who you think you should be. You're showing up as who you actually are, which includes both your gifts and your limitations, your light and your darkness. Jung himself embodied this after his confrontation with the unconscious. He didn't become a guru or a perfect human. He remained complex, difficult, contradictory, fully human. But his work deepened, his relationships became more genuine, and his creative output exploded. He stopped trying to maintain a unified, perfect image and instead allowed himself to be whole, which meant allowing himself to contain contradictions, paradoxes, and unresolved tensions. The principle Jung articulated is that wholeness is not the same as perfection. Perfection requires eliminating parts of yourself. Wholeness requires integrating all parts of yourself. Perfection is a defensive ideal that protects you from having to face your shadow. Wholeness is the courageous acknowledgement that you contain multitudes, that you're capable of both beauty and ugliness, creation and destruction, love and hate. The integrated person doesn't eliminate these opposites. They hold them in conscious tension. This integrated state isn't static. It's not something you achieve once and then maintain forever. The shadow continues to accumulate new material throughout your life as you encounter new situations, new roles, new relationships. Shadow work isn't a project with an end date, it's a practice, an ongoing relationship with the unconscious that requires sustained attention. Jung continued active imagination and dream work until the end of his life, never assuming he had fully mapped his own depths. The most profound effect of shadow integration is that you stop needing to prove anything. The person who has faced their shadow and found that they survived, that they're still here, that they're actually more alive than before, this person develops a kind of unshakable presence, not because they're invulnerable, but because they're no longer fragile. They've seen the worst of themselves and found that it didn't destroy them. What else is there to be afraid of? This is the freedom Jung spoke of when he talked about individuation, not freedom from struggle or challenge, but freedom from the exhausting work of maintaining a false self, freedom from the need to be seen a certain way, freedom from the fear that if people really knew you, they would reject you, because you've already confronted what's most rejectable about yourself and found that you're still worthy of your own acceptance. That self-acceptance doesn't require anyone else's validation. The effects ripple outward in ways you cannot control or predict. When you stop projecting your shadow, you stop participating in collective projections. When you stop scapegoating parts of yourself, you stop participating in the scapegoating of others. When you integrate your own darkness, you become less susceptible to demagogues who promise to eliminate darkness from the world. You become dangerous to any system that relies on people remaining unconscious of their shadows. Jung believed that every individual who does this work contributes to the collective psychological health of humanity. The shadow isn't only personal, it's also collective. When enough individuals integrate their personal shadows, the collective shadow loses some of its grip. This isn't naive optimism. It's recognition that psychological transformation is political, that the work you do on yourself changes the field you participate in, that consciousness itself is contagious. But this isn't a heroic journey with you as the protagonist saving the world. It's something more humble and more profound, becoming conscious enough that you stop unconsciously perpetuating the patterns you inherited. It's breaking the chain of unexamined shadows passed from generation to generation. It's refusing to project onto your children what you couldn't face in yourself. It's the quiet revolution of one person deciding to stop running from their depths. The question is no longer whether shadow work is necessary. Jung demonstrated that it is. The question is whether you have the courage to begin, the discipline to continue, and the honesty to see the process through. Because your shadow is speaking already, every day, in every projection and reaction and repeated pattern. The only question is whether you're ready to listen. Shadow work, as Jung practiced and taught it, is not self-improvement. It's self-recovery. It's the radical act of reclaiming the parts of yourself you've been taught to exile, of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, of ending the civil war within your own psyche. It doesn't make you better than others. It makes you capable of seeing yourself clearly, which is the prerequisite for seeing anything clearly. The process is alchemical in the truest sense. It transforms base material, your rejected, denied, condemned aspects, into psychological gold, not by eliminating them, but by integrating them. Not by transcending your humanity, but by fully inhabiting it. Not by becoming who you think you should be, but by discovering who you actually are beneath the layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear. Jung's final insight was that this work is not optional if you want to live consciously. You can spend your entire life managed by your shadow, repeating patterns you don't understand, projecting onto others what you won't see in yourself, wondering why your best intentions consistently produce outcomes you didn't intend. Or you can turn toward the darkness, meet your shadow on its own terms, and discover that integration is not the death of who you are, but the birth of who you've always been. The freedom Jung discovered on the other side of his confrontation with the unconscious wasn't freedom from the shadow. It was freedom with the shadow. It was the capacity to access the full spectrum of his psyche rather than only the acceptable half. It was the power that comes from no longer fighting yourself. It was the peace of finally coming home to who he actually was, shadow included, and finding that wholeness was what he'd been seeking all along. Conclusion: with CTA, what parts of yourself have you exiled to maintain your self-image? What traits do you condemn most harshly in others? And how might those condemnations be mirrors reflecting your own unacknowledged shadow? Take a moment to sit with these questions, either sharing your reflections in the comments below or simply holding them in silence. Jung believed that the shadow would speak whether you chose to listen or not. But that conscious dialogue with it was the only path to genuine transformation. He would say that your freedom doesn't come from eliminating your darkness, but from bringing it into the light of awareness, where it can no longer control you from the unconscious depths. If this video challenged your understanding of yourself or revealed patterns you're ready to confront, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the human psyche through Carl Jung's revolutionary insights. Until the next video.